Welcome to today's Blueprint News. In this video, we take a deep dive into Canada's latest federal popular vote projection, based on the 338 Canada Federal Poll projection. The latest numbers are in, covering all 343 electoral districts and offering a snapshot of how the political landscape is shaping up ahead of the next federal election. With shifting voter preferences, regional dynamics, and policy debates at play, let's break down the key trends as of 9 February 2025. Northern Territories. The three territories, Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and Yukon, represent a small but significant portion of Canada's electoral map. These areas often see highly competitive races, with Indigenous communities, resource industries, and government employment playing key roles in shaping voter preferences. In Nunavut, the NDP is projected to lead with 47% of the vote, but this figure comes with a margin of error of 15%. This wide margin of error indicates significant uncertainty about the exact level of NDP support. Their actual percentage could fall anywhere between 32% and 62%, meaning the NDP's lead is not entirely secure and could be influenced by changing factors such as shifts in voter behavior, campaign events, or external developments. This also means the NDP's position, while favorable, remains vulnerable to changes in public opinion or emerging political dynamics as the election approaches. The Liberal Party, LPC, holds second place with 27%, but their margin of error of 13% means their actual vote share could vary between 14% and 40%. While currently trailing the NDP, this uncertainty leaves room for a significant swing in their favor, especially if national trends shift or their local campaign efforts gain momentum. Late-stage campaigning, adjustments in policy focus, or reactions to national events could push the Liberals' support higher, making it possible for them to close the gap with the NDP. The Conservative Party, CPC, is in third place with 22% support, and a margin of error of 12% means their true support could fluctuate anywhere between 10% and 34%. While the Conservatives are trailing, this margin reflects the volatility of their position and shows they could still make a comeback, particularly if voters reconsider their preferences or if there's a strategic campaign push in key regions. This margin also underscores the uncertainty involved in predicting outcomes in less populated regions like Nunavut, where voter behavior can be more difficult to predict. The Green Party, GPC, with 3%, has a smaller margin of error of 5%, meaning their actual support could shift slightly within that range. Although the Greens are not expected to be a major player in Nunavut, this margin shows that their vote share could change based on unexpected fluctuations in voter behavior, such as a late surge of interest or a change in the political climate. However, it's unlikely that the Green Party will gain substantial ground in this region. In the Northwest Territories, the race is currently a toss-up between the Liberal Party, LPC, New Democratic Party, NDP, and Conservative Party, CPC. The Liberals lead with 35% of the vote, but this comes with a margin of error of 11%, meaning their actual support could fall anywhere between 24% and 46%. While the Liberals are in the lead, the wide margin reflects the uncertainty in their position, as late-stage campaigns or shifts in national sentiment could affect the outcome. The NDP follows closely at 31%, also with a margin of error of 11%, meaning their true support could range from 20% to 42%. While they are slightly behind the Liberals, the margin shows that the NDP could still make significant gains, especially if there's a shift in local or national political dynamics that favors their platform. The Conservative Party, CPC, is in third place with 28%, with a margin of error of 10%, meaning their actual support could vary between 18% and 38%. The Conservatives, though currently trailing, are still within striking distance, and their position is volatile enough to allow for a late surge if their messaging resonates with voters as the election approaches. The Green Party, GPC, holds 6% of the vote, with a margin of error of 6%, meaning their support could fluctuate between 0% and 12%. While the Greens are unlikely to be a major contender in the Northwest Territories, the margin reflects the possibility of slight shifts due to local issues or changes in public interest. This toss-up scenario highlights the fluidity of the race in the Northwest Territories, where all three major parties have a chance at gaining the upper hand. The margins of error are crucial here, emphasizing the uncertainty of predicting a clear winner. With such close percentages and potential shifts, this region is one to watch closely as the election approaches. In Yukon, the Conservative Party CPC is leaning toward a lead with 35% of the vote, though this comes with a margin of error of 10%, meaning their actual support could fall between 25% and 45%. While the CPC is currently in the lead, the margin reflects some uncertainty, as their support could fluctuate depending on factors like late-stage campaigning or shifting political dynamics in the region. The Liberal Party, LPC, follows closely with 29% and a margin of error of 9%. Their actual support could range from 20% to 38%, leaving room for significant movement. The margin of error suggests that the Liberals are still competitive and could gain ground, especially if their campaign resonates more strongly with voters as election day nears. The New Democratic Party, NDP, is in third place with 28%, also with a margin of error of 9%, meaning their true support could vary between 19% and 37%. Like the Liberals, the NDP remains in the race, and their position is fluid. With strategic campaigning, they could pull ahead or fall further behind, depending on how the political environment shifts. The Green Party, GPC, holds 6% of the vote, with a margin of error of 5%, indicating their support could range from 1% to 11%. While unlikely to be a major contender, the Green Party still has the potential for a minor shift in their favor, depending on local issues or last-minute interest. Yukon is a leaning conservative region, but the margin of error indicates a close race, particularly between the CPC, LPC, and NDP. With each party within striking distance, this region remains competitive, and any shifts in voter sentiment or external factors could influence the final outcome. In British Columbia, which has 43 electoral districts, the Conservative Party, CPC, currently leads with 47% of the vote, but with a margin of error of 6%. This means their actual support could range anywhere from 41% to 53%. Although the CPC has a relatively strong lead, the margin of error shows some uncertainty, meaning there is still a chance for their position to shift, especially if political dynamics change leading up to election day. The New Democratic Party, NDP, is in second place with 23%, and their margin of error is 5%, which means their support could fluctuate between 18% and 28%. While the NDP is behind, their relatively narrow range suggests they could still make up ground if there's a change in voter sentiment or if the Conservatives experience a drop in support. The Liberal Party, LPC, holds 22% with a margin of error of 5%, indicating their true support could range between 17% and 27%. Though the Liberals are currently trailing, their margin of error suggests there is still potential for a late surge. Changes in the political landscape or strategic campaign efforts could alter their position. The Green Party, GPC, holds 6% with a margin of error of 3%, meaning their support could range from 3% to 9%. Although the Greens are unlikely to make a significant impact in British Columbia, this margin shows that any shifts in voter preferences could slightly adjust their standing. Overall, British Columbia is currently leaning toward the Conservatives, but with significant uncertainty. The margin of error for all parties reflects that this race is still very much in play, and as we approach election day, shifts in political momentum or public sentiment could reshape the outcome. In Alberta, with 37 electoral districts, the Conservative Party, CPC, is showing a commanding lead with 62% of the vote and a margin of error of 6%. This means their actual support could fall anywhere between 56% and 68%. The CPC's substantial lead, with a relatively small margin of error, suggests they are well positioned in Alberta, though any shifts in voter sentiment or changes in national politics could affect the final numbers. The New Democratic Party, NDP, is in second place with 17% and a margin of error of 4%. Their actual support could range from 13% to 21%, indicating some uncertainty, though it's clear that the NDP is not currently in a strong position to challenge the Conservatives in Alberta. Despite this, changes in political dynamics could shift the NDP's standing slightly, though it's unlikely to impact the CPC's dominance significantly. The Liberal Party, LPC, is in third place with 14%, with a margin of error of 4%, which means their support could range between 10% and 18%. While the Liberals are trailing behind the NDP, the margin of error indicates that there is potential for slight movement in their favor, depending on late-stage campaigns or changes in local political conditions. Alberta remains a stronghold for the Conservative Party, with a decisive lead. However, the margin of error for the NDP and LPC highlights that, while Alberta's political landscape is largely stable, shifts in national trends or local issues could still impact the final results, though the CPC's position is unlikely to be seriously threatened. In the prairies, with 28 electoral districts, the Conservative Party, CPC, leads with 53% of the vote and a margin of error of 6%. This means their actual support could range from 47% to 59%. While the CPC is in a solid position, the margin of error shows there's still room for change. If there is a shift in voter sentiment or unforeseen events, their position could slightly fluctuate, but they are currently in a strong lead. The New Democratic Party, NDP, holds 20%, with a margin of error of 5%, indicating their actual support could range between 15% and 25%. The NDP's relatively smaller share of the vote suggests they are trailing significantly, but the margin of error indicates there is some potential for growth, particularly if their messaging resonates more strongly with voters as the election draws closer. The Liberal Party, LPC, is in third place with 18% and a margin of error of 4%. This means their support could range from 14% to 22%, suggesting there is room for a slight surge. Though the Liberals are currently behind the NDP, there is potential for them to close the gap, especially if they can capitalize on changing national trends or local issues that appeal to voters. The prairies are still leaning heavily in favor of the Conservative Party, but the margin of error for all three major parties highlights the potential for shifts in support. While the CPC's position seems stable, both the NDP and LPC have some room to adjust their standing in the final stretch leading up to Election Day. In Ontario, with 122 electoral districts, the Conservative Party, CPC, currently leads with 44% of the vote, though their margin of error of 6% means their actual support could range from 38% to 50%. While the CPC holds a strong lead in the province, the margin of error shows some uncertainty, with their support potentially fluctuating depending on changes in the political landscape or late-stage developments in the campaign. The Liberal Party, LPC, follows with 32%, and their margin of error of 6% suggests their support could range from 26% to 38%. While the Liberals trail the Conservatives, the margin leaves room for movement. If there's a shift in national or local political dynamics, the LPC could see a rise in support, particularly if their messaging resonates more with voters or if they manage to capture key swing regions. The New Democratic Party, NDP, is in third place with 17%, with a margin of error of 4%, meaning their actual support could range from 13% to 21%. While the NDP is well behind the top two parties, there's still potential for a slight increase in their support, especially if their platform gains traction in specific regions, or if there's a late change in voter sentiment. The Green Party, GPC, holds 4% of the vote with a margin of error of 3%, meaning their actual support could vary between 1% and 7%. Though their share of the vote is small, the margin of error means there's still potential for slight changes in their standing, though they are unlikely to become a major contender in Ontario. The People's Party of Canada, PPC, has 3% of the vote, with a margin of error of 3%, indicating their support could fluctuate between 0% and 6%. While the PPC is not expected to make a significant impact in Ontario, this margin allows for minor shifts in their support, depending on late developments or changes in voter behavior. In conclusion, Ontario is currently leaning toward the Conservative Party, but the margin of error shows that the Liberal Party is still in contention and could gain ground. The NDP, while trailing, still has some room to grow, and smaller parties like the Greens and PPC might see some shifts in support. With the race still in play, the final outcome in Ontario will depend on how voters respond to the candidates and issues leading up to Election Day. In Quebec, with 78 electoral districts, the Bloc Québécois, BQ, leads with 33% of the vote and a margin of error of 5%, meaning their actual support could range from 28% to 38%. While the Bloc Québécois is in the lead, the margin of error indicates some uncertainty, suggesting that their position could fluctuate based on regional shifts or late-stage developments in the campaign. The Conservative Party, CPC, follows closely with 25% of the vote and a margin of error of 5%, meaning their support could range from 20% to 30%. The CPC has gained some ground in Quebec, with the margin showing that they could either close the gap with the Bloc Québécois or experience a drop in support, depending on changes in the political landscape. The Liberal Party, LPC, is also at 25%, with a margin of error of 4%, which means their support could fluctuate between 21% and 29%. The Liberals are in a competitive position, but are still trailing behind both the Bloc and the Conservatives. The margin of error leaves some potential for movement, especially if there are shifts in the political environment or if their message resonates more with voters as Election Day approaches. The New Democratic Party, NDP, holds 11%, and their margin of error of 3% suggests their support could range from 8% to 14%. The NDP is significantly behind the top three parties, and while they still have a chance to make slight gains, their overall position in Quebec remains weaker. The Green Party, GPC, holds 3%, with a margin of error of 2%, meaning their support could range from 1% to 5%. While the Green Party's share of the vote is relatively small, the margin of error indicates that there could be slight shifts in their support, though they are unlikely to become a serious contender in Quebec. Quebec is a highly competitive province, with the Bloc Québécois leading, but the Conservative Party and Liberal Party are closely behind. The margin of error suggests that the race could tighten, with the NDP and Green Party trailing, but still capable of minor shifts. As Quebec's political landscape remains fluid, this region will be crucial to watch as Election Day approaches. In Atlantic Canada, with 32 electoral districts, the Conservative Party, CPC, leads with 43% of the vote and a margin of error of 6%, meaning their actual support could range from 37% to 49%. While the CPC is in a strong position, the margin of error shows that their lead could fluctuate depending on political developments or changes in voter sentiment in the lead up to the election. The Liberal Party, LPC, follows with 34%, and their margin of error of 6% means their support could range from 28% to 40%. Though the Liberals are behind, the margin suggests they could still make gains, especially if their campaign resonates more with voters in key areas or if there's a shift in the national narrative as Election Day nears. The New Democratic Party, NDP, holds 15% with a margin of error of 4%, meaning their actual support could vary between 11% and 19%. The NDP's position in Atlantic Canada is not as strong, but the margin of error leaves room for minor movement in their support, though it's unlikely they will make significant headway against the top two parties. The Green Party, GPC, has 4% of the vote, with a margin of error of 3%, indicating their support could range from 1% to 7%. While the Greens are not expected to be a major contender in this region, their support could shift slightly depending on local issues or last-minute changes in voter behavior. Atlantic Canada is currently leaning toward the Conservative Party, but the Liberal Party is still competitive, and the margin of error leaves room for some shifts in voter sentiment. The NDP and Green Party are trailing, but could experience minor changes in their support. As the election approaches, this region remains fluid, and any late-stage developments could impact the final outcome. With these shifts across the country, the electoral landscape remains dynamic. The Conservatives continue to lead in most regions, but the Liberals are showing gains in key battlegrounds, suggesting a tightening race. Meanwhile, the NDP is seeing mixed results, holding strong in some areas while declining in others. The Bloc remains strong in Quebec, but faces increased competition from Federalist parties. The Green Party and PPC remain minor players, but continue to hold small, dedicated voter bases. As election day draws closer, these trends could continue to evolve based on campaign strategies, policy announcements, and voter engagement. Will the Conservatives maintain their lead and secure a majority? Can the Liberals build enough momentum to challenge them in key ridings? Will the NDP and Bloc strengthen their positions and influence the balance of power? Stay tuned for more updates on Canada's political landscape as we get closer to the election. That's the latest on Canada's federal popular vote projection. As voter preferences shift and the political landscape evolves, we'll keep tracking the trends and breaking them down for you here on today's Blueprint News. If you found this analysis insightful, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss an update.